Hello and welcome to this video. In this video, we would learn to compliance scan Docker host and containers. A Docker host is the runtime environment that manages Docker images and containers on a machine. With the help of the Docker daemon, it manages the complete life cycle of a container, and with the command line interface, it provides a beautiful way to interact with the Docker daemon. Docker daemon can start multiple containers in parallel, and with the help of InSpec, we can scan both Docker host and a running container. We would use Docker connection to connect to the container in case we scan the container. So let's first start with understanding how to scan the Docker host for this. We have 3 InSpec resources that helps us to verify a Docker host's environment. Docker container. This resource helps us to verify the running containers. To scan images, we have Docker image resource. Very often we use it to ensure a specific Docker image is not used in our environment anymore. Next is the Docker resource, which is more complex to use than Docker image and Docker container resource, but allows us to implement more complex query scenarios. Let's look into a few of the methods available with Docker resources. Containers method returns all running and exited containers by running docker ps-a with no truncation under the hood. Images method returns all locally available images by running docker images command under the hood. And version is the parsed content of docker version command. Object with the ID, that is a container ID, returns information about the Docker object and parses the object from Docker inspect ID command. We would also scan the Docker container using this Docker connection. Let's execute the scan and learn more about it now. To demonstrate this, I will use Docker, which is already installed on my Chef Workstation, and demonstrate how we scan Docker host and container. In case you don't have Docker installed on your workstation, you can run apt install docker.io. So let's first start with Docker container resource. The Docker container resource helps us to verify running containers. So to demonstrate this, I will start a Postgres database container. So I'll start with docker run command. Specify the name with -- name. I'm giving the name as container_Postgres. I'll specify the environment variable, which is the password for the Postgres database, as my secret password. I would run this container in detached mode, so provide -d option. And I specify the port mapping with -p option. So I'm specifying the host port as 5432 and the container port as 5432. So Postgres SQL container starts listening on 5432 port number on the host and inside the container. I'm stitching up that pipe between the host virtual machine, which is the Docker host, and the container. And I specify the image with which it starts running, which is the Postgres. So the container creation command execution is done, and the container should have been created. We can create a test file which can ensure that this Postgres container is running and the ports is mapped. A simple inspect test can be created for this. I have already created docker_container.rb. Let me quickly run through the content of it for you. So I'll vi docker_container.rb. In this, if you see, I have used Docker container resource, and I'm specifying the name of the container which I want to inspect. And on this Docker host, I mentioned that this particular container should be existing. It should be in running state. The image with which it has started should be equivalent to Postgres. And the ports which it has opened has to be 5432 on the host and 5432 on the container. And at the end, we verify if Docker entry point script is used to initialize the container data at runtime. And we end the code block by end statement. Let me quit from this file. And let's execute this test on the Docker host and verify the checks for the Postgres container. InSpec exec is the command. So I give InSpec exec with docker_container.rb. The scan is executed and you can see the results. Next, let's learn to use Docker image resource. As I already mentioned, very often we use this to check whether a specific Docker image is not used in our environment anymore. Like for example, Ubuntu 12.04 has gone end of life, and I want to make sure no container uses that particular image. So I can either write a test file how I did it for PostgreSQL container, or quickly run the code block in InSpec shell itself. So let me use InSpec shell this time. We can make sure that the image is not available on the Docker host by writing a code block like describe. I use the resource docker_image. I specify the filter, which is the name of the image, and then I specify the condition. It should not exist. And I end the block. So this following test ensures that Ubuntu 12.04's latest image is not available on our Docker host. Next is the Docker resource, which is more complex to use. So let's use few method and get a feel of it. I have created a test file named docker.rb. Let me take you through the content of the file. So in the first code block, it ensures that none of the containers are using Ubuntu 12.04 OS image. And we can write complex queries as well. So if you see the next block, I want to verify the configuration of each running container. And in the first statement, I say docker.containers. I'm calling the containers method. I'm checking if it's running. I'm getting all the IDs of the running containers and I'm running a loop with that ID. And I'm calling docker inspect to retrieve the detailed information about each of the containers. I end the describe block and then end the loop. So let me execute this test file. InSpec exec docker.rb would be the command. And it will check through all the containers which are in running state in your machine. So this is how the output of the test run looks like. So this was all about testing the Docker host. These resources are used in DevSec's Docker benchmark to ensure best practices for security and configuration for Docker host. Now let's learn to use InSpec with a running container to ensure the container is configured correctly. For example, if I have an Ubuntu container and I want to check if it complies to the DevSec Linux baseline, this particular baseline ensures OS hardening. So I can execute this InSpec scan on the Ubuntu container. But I should be on that Docker host to run this. So either you can clone the InSpec profile or specify the GitHub link itself. Let me first clone the InSpec profile to run against the Docker container. So I'll git clone from this GitHub link. And I will have to have a running container to inspect on that. So I will first start a Ubuntu container. I specify docker run with -dti. I give the image Ubuntu 14.04 and bin bash as the entry point for that container. So using the inspec cli, we can run profile against this Docker container by passing the path of Linux baseline profile, which I've just cloned. So let's do that. First, let's check what is the container ID with docker ps command. So we have got the container ID. Either you can run InSpec exec, provide the path of your Linux baseline, and then -t specifies the target. Docker is the connection type, so I would mention Docker and then the container ID. In case I have not cloned, instead of Linux-baseline, I can give the complete Git URL and execute the profile. So here you would see there are a lot of failure conditions as well. So you can check which all parameters are not as per expectation with respect to the Linux baseline and then go ahead and make the changes accordingly. So in this video, we learned to run compliance scan on Docker host and container both. In the next video, we will learn how to automate audit with Habitat and InSpec. So see you then.